Hi, everyone, and welcome back. On August 1st, 2016, outside the presidential office building in Taipei, President Tsai Ing-wen conducted a formal apology ceremony to the island's indigenous peoples.
On the occasion of Taiwan's annual Indigenous Peoples Day, President Tsai Ing-wen issued a formal apology to the island's original inhabitants for the political, economic, and environmental exploitation they had endured over the past 400 years.
The gathering commenced in the morning with a traditional shouting ritual and the lighting of millet stalks to invoke ancestral spirits. In her address, President Tsai declared, "For the 4 centuries of pain and mistreatment you have endured, I apologize to you on behalf of the government." In her speech, the president spoke of the 400-year legacy of colonization, land seizure, cultural suppression, and forced assimilation and environmental burdens faced by Taiwan's indigenous peoples, citing Dutch, Qing, Japanese, and post-1945 regimes. All of those governments.
There's a book called The Complete History of Taiwan, and it's typical of Han Chinese historiography, in that it recorded Taiwan's history from the perspective of the more powerful groups. For this, I offer my apology to the indigenous peoples of Taiwan on behalf of our government. Over the past 400 years, every regime in Taiwan seriously infringed on the existing rights of indigenous peoples through the use of military force and the theft of land. For this, I offer my apology to the indigenous peoples of Taiwan on behalf of our government.
Tsai emphasized that Taiwan must confront the truth of its history. Unless we deny that we are a country of justice, we must face up to the history. We must tell the truth, and then, most importantly, the government must genuinely reflect on this past. She also announced institutional reforms, the formation of an Indigenous Historical Justice and Transitional Justice Committee under the presidential office, and a commitment to pursue legislation concerning indigenous land, self-governance, and rights.
Tsai also put forth concrete proposals to help safeguard the interests of indigenous peoples.
I want to officially announce that the presidential office will be setting up a commission to deal with the issues of historical and transitional justice for indigenous peoples. I will personally act as the convener of the commission in my capacity as the nation's head of state, and I will work with the representatives of each and every tribe in the collective pursuit of historical justice.
This was a seminal moment in Taiwan's history. This event, it was the first that Taiwan ever made, the first official apology to its indigenous communities, ever, marking a symbolic shift in state-indigenous relations. By the time that President Tsai took office in 2016, indigenous activism in Taiwan, it had already gained unprecedented national visibility. For decades, indigenous communities had challenged the legacies of Japanese colonialism and the Kuomintang, their authoritarianism that stripped them of land, restricted hunting and cultural practices, and imposed assimilation policies under the banner of modernization. Now, to contextualize all that's happening in this moment, from the 1980s onward, coinciding with these indigenous movements and their rise, was Taiwan's democratic transition, which also gave rise to environmentalism and feminism, each group demanding justice and recognition from the state. Indigenous leaders, building on global human rights discourses, pressed for the restoration of ancestral territories and the meaningful participation in policymaking. And so by the early 2000s, these efforts led to the passage of the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law and a growing expectation that the government address the deeper structural injustices that persisted despite democratic reform. That's what I mean when I say this is a very seminal moment in Taiwan's history. It was addressing all of those 4 periods of governmental subordination of indigenous people in Taiwan. So now you can understand that Tsai's 2016 apology to indigenous people, it wasn't a spontaneous act. It was the culmination of years, of decades of organized struggle and shifting political currents. It took place within a broader moment of reckoning in Taiwan society, as movements for transitional justice sought to address the authoritarian legacies of the White Terror and the enduring inequalities rooted in periods of colonial rule. Tsai's apology, it acknowledged these centuries of dispossession, forced assimilation, and state-led exploitation of indigenous lands, and it promised to advance self-governance and environmental protection through new legal and administrative reforms. The thing is, this apology, it also reflected Taiwan's ongoing struggle to define itself as both a democracy and a post-colonial nation. Its modern development agenda with indigenous sovereignty and ecological justice. Waves of political movement that don't always align. And in this lesson, you'll understand why they actually don't most of the time. In this week's lecture, we're going to be focusing on that intersection between the global environmentalist movement and indigenous communities in Taiwan. As always, we'll use what we've learned about empire, how the legacies of empire, colonization, and post-war economic policies of developmentalism, all of these things have directly shaped the contours surrounding this intersection. But this week, we're going to use all of those analytical tools that we've been piecing together to understand how indigenous rights on the island and their claims to their lands both converge with and diverge from the aims of liberal environmentalist activism today. You'll understand how this collision has come to define Taiwan's environmental and indigenous politics. And hopefully, you'll also begin to understand some of the complexities confronting global environmentalist movements throughout the world today, not just in Taiwan, but everywhere. But to understand why indigenous rights around the world are often impeded by it, and sometimes even ignored within the environmentalist movement. It's important first to have a clear sense of what environmentalism actually means. In its broadest sense, environmentalism refers to a widely held belief that human societies must protect and manage the natural world. How? Through conscious action and reform, both in terms of personal behavior and also governmental policy. And over the course of the 20th century, environmentalism, it evolved into a heterogeneous set of global movements that responded to urgent ecological crises such as pollution, deforestation, and the destruction of ecosystems. Yet, as the anthropologist Tanya Murray Lee has pointed out, many of these movements have come to operate through a logic that she calls the will to improve. According to her, the will to improve, it's a concept that's described by a drive to manage both nature and people through technical expertise and state intervention. But here it's really critical to ask, who are these experts? And is the state truly the best system to manage this kind of intervention? You know, in all honesty, just as it's difficult to define a concept like neoliberalism in a simple or straightforward way, it's equally challenging to summarize what Lee means by the concept, the will to improve.
Tried to do then in the book, The Will to Improve, is to make the whole process of intervention strange. This idea that one group of people, authorities, experts, trustees, as I call them in the book, planners, would for some reason take responsibility for the welfare and the well-being of another group of people and intervene in their lives. So we now take this rather for granted under the label of development. But if we do step back and think about it, it is quite a strange thing, that one group of people should take upon themselves to intervene in the lives of others.
Still, neoliberalism, it provides a really useful starting point to understand this concept. You see, one of the most important components to understanding a concept like neoliberalism is focusing on this understanding of who neoliberals think of and identify as so-called experts, particularly those from institutions like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. You see, these so-called experts, they exercise tremendous power to determine how developing countries must restructure their economies, for example, which policies governments must adopt, and literally whom amongst the millions living within those countries are worthy of receiving aid. And these decisions, they're often made by individuals who will never set foot in these countries. Think about that. Much less in the villages and towns directly impacted by their policies. Lee's notion of the will to improve, it captures a similar logic within environmentalism. This impulse to improve often transforms environmentalism into a project of management, rather than one that actually seeks to liberate or even empower the people most connected to the very lands and ecologies that they were supposed to improve. And it reimagines the environment as something to be fixed or optimized. And of course, those who are responsible for fixing and improving these environments, these outside experts of scientists, technocrats, and policymakers, while the communities most affected are positioned as passive recipients of external knowledge. You see, in this way, liberal approaches to environmentalism often mirrors and even reproduces colonial relationships. And in a very real sense, efforts to save the planet, they often end up reproducing the same hierarchies of power and expertise that created many of the ecological crises they now seek to solve. One of the most important Taiwanese scholars who has been really tackling this collision, the collision between environmentalism in Taiwan and the country's indigenous communities, is a professor named Wang Tingjie. His research on indigenous politics and environmentalism in Taiwan, it really provides a clear and material example of Lee's concept of the will to improve. One thing that I really appreciate about Wang's analysis, and the reason why you're reading his work this week, is that he begins his story with Japanese colonialism and later the KMT. During the Japanese colonial era and the decades of Kuomintang rule that followed, according to Wang, state-led environmental policies, they were inextricably tied to broader projects of modernization and colonialism. Even then, the forests, mountains, and rivers, they weren't just natural resources. All of these things became instruments of colonial governance.
However, since the Japanese colonial era, 99% of those mountains and forests have been claimed as government land. After the KMT government came to Taiwan in 1945, they put the nation's forests under the management of the Forestry Bureau. The traditional hunting and gathering activity of the indigenous peoples went under one legal restriction after another.
And much later, when the state declared indigenous lands as public forests or conservation zones, these policies were built upon previous colonial epistemologies in Taiwan by redefining indigenous people as subjects in need of regulation. That's colonialism. As Wang puts it, agents of environmental protection have often represented alien institutions imposed on indigenous lands and living spaces. So today, in Taiwan's so-called democratic period, environmental reform continues to be guided by liberal ideas of sustainability that still privilege bureaucratic and scientific authority over indigenous sovereignty. For example, national parks and wildlife protection laws, they've restricted traditional hunting and farming practices, things that are central to the traditions and beliefs of indigenous people in Taiwan, let alone their primary source of income. So essentially what these policies have done is to criminalize the very culture and identities of indigenous people.
Sometimes when I hunt on my land and bring home a barking deer, I get apprehended by the National Park Police. I tell the prosecutor that I have been hunting since I was little. He will ask me, "Are you planning to sell this or what?" To which I say, "No, I hunted it so that I could eat it."
Both Lee's and Wang's insights, they reveal a paradox at the heart of modern environmentalism, not just in Taiwan, but globally. One that reaches all the way back to colonialism and the fundamental belief held by many in Europe and the United States, as well as Japan, that they were improving the lives of those they colonized. Perhaps in some ways they did, but as you know by now, those so-called improvements, they came with an enormous cost. Environmentalism, which is obviously different from colonialism in so many ways, it shares this one piece of logic in colonialism. And because of this, sometimes environmentalist organizations and even entire movements of environmentalism, they end up making life worse for the very communities that they claim to help.